So I have been thinking a lot about the experience, that sense of transcendence. I don't know if you've ever had this. And it left me wondering what happens to us when we live in a world where we can't have transcendent experiences, because they often happen out there. I'm curious if any of you, leave a comment if this is true for you. Have you ever had a transcendent experience just sitting at home in your chair? Maybe you will today. That's my hope today, that you have a transcendent experience at home. But in general, most of our transcendent experiences happen out. They happen with people, or they happen in the middle of nowhere by ourselves, but they happen away. So I've wondered about this. What happens to us as a people if we are in this situation where we can't go out there for a while? Are we going to be like those Israelites that were grumbling? Did you bring us out here in the desert to die of thirst? A few weeks ago, Ashley and I went to this massive arena, the Bridgestone Arena downtown, and we parked on the other side of the river over by the football stadium so we could walk over, because I personally enjoy walking around cities at night. It's one of those times where it's a weird busyness and quiet at the same time, because it's night, it's a little quieter, but there's still people everywhere. If you've obviously been to downtown Nashville, you realize, well, not today, but in general, Broadway's a mess. And even though we were a block away, it's still a lot of people walking around, but it can still feel quiet. I love lights and the reflection off the water. I love it. There's people walking around, people going to the concert, people going to bars, people going to honky-tonks, people waiting for Uber rides with their friends. And we sat high enough up at the concert to see everything at the show. We could see the lights. We could see these enormous curtains behind the band. We could see the screens that appeared when they pulled the curtains aside. We could see the confetti everywhere in the air. And I don't know about you, but experiences like that, concerts where you feel completely saturated in this experience, the crowd, the show, the music. And even though this wasn't particularly a religious band, it still felt a little bit like going to church. It felt like a religious experience, an experience of transcendence. The crowd, they knew every word, they sang every note. In the band, they were begging us to join in. Sing the song with us, they say. And everybody sings, and there we are in this midst of people. And I was reminded in that moment, there's something bigger than me. There's something bigger than all of us, and we get to be a part of it. That's kind of how we define transcendence, where we get a little outside of ourselves and realize there's something bigger than us out there. I've heard people talk about that type of experience in more than just concerts. I've heard people talk about it at college football games. Stephen, have you ever had that experience? I know you're a big LSU fan. You've had that LSU where, when the War Eagle's flying around, your just heart's racing. You're part of something bigger. I've been to a few University of Tennessee games. I was at a game years ago where they played Arkansas, and it went into 6 overtimes, and it got over at 1 a.m. And I want to tell you, that was definitely not a religious experience, unless you count a bunch of drunk people falling into you and spilling things on you. I don't really think that's part of the religious canon. But I do hear people talk about that, roaring crowds, screaming, knowing every chant song. When Ashley and I got married, she had to indoctrinate me into the ways of all the very strange University of Florida chant songs about bits and quarters and things like that. It's interesting, but everyone knows them, and when you do them, you feel like you're part of something bigger, and it's this wonderful feeling. It is transcendence. That feeling can happen in musicals. Did you feel that one, Amy, when you were at Hamilton recently? I know that's a common experience with that weeping. I remember years ago, even though it obviously wasn't new, I saw Les Mis on Broadway, and I feel that I'm a musical guy. I feel that every time now I take my daughter to a musical. We could see a community production of Beauty and the Beast, which we did when she was little. She loved it, and it's this experience of transcendence. Maybe you have it when you feel you get to go hear your favorite author speak. That experience, I think, also happens when we travel. When we've gone to places that we've never been before, we see them for the first time. We were actually today supposed to be in Las Vegas, and tomorrow heading toward the Grand Canyon, a place I've never been before. And I was expecting transcendence. You know, it takes your breath away. It makes you feel there's something bigger, and that's a good thing. You're not swallowed up by it. You're not forgotten. You're a part of it. It can happen sometimes and sneak up on you when you're having a particularly good dinner with friends. As followers of Jesus, I know that we would say we've experienced transcendence in the midst of worship, where the Spirit moves and takes us by surprise, where Jesus speaks to us through song and through scripture and bread and wine and handshake and hug. But what happens to us if we can't do those things? If for the good of each other, if for the good of the community as a whole, we forgo those things that give us so much life? It's a paradox, isn't it? Because we love one another, we can't see one another. Because we care for the health of everybody, it means even if you yourself aren't particularly at risk, if you're not sick, you still keep yourself at home because you want to make sure the larger community is healthy. It's difficult when we feel stuck living our lives room to room in our apartments or our houses. I know personally our cat is a little curious why so many people are home all the time, and I'm looking forward to many times as I'm working from home, him doing the thing where he walks across my keyboard. I'm looking forward to that. So I do think of this, I do think of this as a season of thirst. We're thirsting for that spiritual experience of transcendence. Just like the woman at the well. Just like the Israelites in the desert of sin. And because it sounds like wilderness, it sounds to me like Sinai. It reminds me of those Israelites there in the desert of sin. It reminds me of Elijah when he runs into the desert beyond Beersheba to Mount Horeb. It reminds me of David on the run from Saul in the wilderness when he's worried that Saul is going to kill him. It reminds me of what we just talked about, Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness that we talked about a couple weeks ago. To me, what we're going through sounds a lot like Lent. It's strange that it would happen right now, isn't it? There's going to be plenty to mourn in this wilderness. We can mourn the anxiety and fear it's already caused, and we can mourn the anxiety and fear that's certainly going to continue in many lives. We can mourn the loss of employment for many people, the loss of security and income. We can mourn even as Christians with prophetic imaginations. We mourn those we don't even know about or those we don't see, the vulnerable who will suffer. We've seen that firsthand because we see, as people who support in the ministry of Room at the Inn, we see the ability for these churches to house homeless individuals is collapsing. And on one hand, we're thankful. We're thankful that the weather's better. It's not freezing outside. It's been warmer days. But it's still something we mourn because we don't want these people to have to sleep on the street. And we know this to be true, that we will have to mourn the loss of life. And so we're thirsty. We're thirsty for rich spiritual experiences that make us feel part of this whole and not so alone. We're thirsty for good news about testing and treatment and cures. We're thirsty for good news for politicians to get their act together and stop blaming everybody, to just get it done. We're thirsty. We're thirsty for our nation, our communities to come together and serve. And some of y'all are probably thirsty for help. because you might feel vulnerable enough that you can't go out and you need someone to help you through this time. But it's my hope is that as people of faith, we might know that this is not a wilderness that we journey into alone. So like those Israelites in Sinai in that desert of sin, where they were living in a time where they had to let God lead because they simply don't know where they're going. I pray that we learn that lesson. I pray that, like Elijah and Mount Horeb, we're living in a time where we can learn to listen to God's voice. That's the sound of sheer silence, still and soft. I pray that we learn to live like David fleeing Saul in the wilderness, where we have to turn our fears over to God and know that God protects and keeps us eternally safe. I pray that we understand, like Jesus, that in this wilderness, it's testing and preparation for us. But above all things, my friends, I pray that we know that when we go to God with our thirst, God is a God. God is a God who provides because we are thirsty for good news. I pray that we know that God might have us strike rocks to quench the thirst of others that so desperately need it. I pray that God knows and God will answer our prayers of this thirst, that we might know that we are leaders that can help in that. I pray that we have the courage to be honest about our need if we can't help others, but we can just simply say, I am thirsty for help getting groceries. I'm thirsty for contact with other individuals to feel not so alone. I'm thirsty to talk to someone because I'm so anxious. Know that if you strike that stick, God will provide because we are thirsty. And so may Christ be with you. May Christ be before you. May Christ be behind you and Christ be in you. May Christ be beneath you. May Christ be on your right and on your left. May Christ be with you when you lie down and when you rise up. May Christ be with us all in this season of wilderness.